My name is Illy Brandt. I'm 30 years old, and I learned the hardest things about love standing in a lawyer's office that smelled like old coffee, holding a will that told me I had 6 weeks to find a wife or lose everything my grandfather ever built. I should tell you about the yard first, because the yard is most of who I am. Brandt & Sons wooden boat sits at the bottom of Mill Street in Quarry Cove, a working harbor town tucked into the granite folds of Penobscot Bay, where the water is the color of slate in the morning and turns to hammered gold by evening. My grandfather Gus built that shed with his own hands before I was born. He planked it, shingled it, hung the big sliding doors that groan when the wind comes off the bay, and for 60 years he bent oak and cedar into hulls that still float in harbors up and down this coast. People here do not say a boat is well made. They say it is Brandt made. That meant something. It still does. My parents left when I was 6. I do not say that for sympathy. It is simply the shape of the thing. One spring they were there, and by autumn there was just Gus, a man in his 60s with sawdust in the creases of his hands, learning how to braid a small boy's confusion into something a child could live inside. He raised me in the loft above the shop. He taught me to read a grain of wood, the way other men read a newspaper. He taught me that a thing built slowly and honestly will outlast the man who built it, and that this was not sad, it was the entire point. Gus died about a year before that date in the lawyer's office. He went the way he wanted, quietly in his chair by the stove, with a half-sanded tiller across his knees. And I will be honest with you, because there is no use lying to strangers. The thing I was most afraid of in this world was not the bay in a gale. It was the silence of that loft after he was gone. It was the specific terror of becoming exactly what he had been at the end, a good man alone, married to his work, with no one to leave the light on for. The yard kept about a dozen people working. Old Ray, who had caulked seams since before I could walk. The Pelletier brothers. Dana, who did the varnish work so fine you could see the harbor in it. Their families ate because that shed stayed open. So when I say I was afraid, understand that the fear had a dozen faces, and not one of them was only mine. The lawyer's name was Mr. Coombs, and he read the clause twice because he could see I did not believe it the first time. Gus's trust left the yard to me. The land, the shed, the tools, the half-finished boats, all of it on one condition. By the settling date, the 1-year reading of the will, which fell exactly 6 weeks away on my 30th birthday, I had to be, in the words Gus had chosen himself, married and keeping a home. If I was not, the trustee was bound to sell the waterfront parcel to the only buyer circling it, a resort developer who wanted to pour the whole working harbor into concrete and call it a marina. I sat there in that office, and I felt the floor tilt under me like a deck in a swell. My grandfather, the most loving man I ever knew, had reached out from the grave and handed me an impossible thing. So now I am going to tell you the most foolish, desperate thing I have ever done, and how it saved far more than a boatyard. 2 days later, I did something I am still not entirely sure I can explain. I asked a woman I barely knew to marry me. Not for love. Not even for not yet. I asked her because we were both drowning, and sometimes two people grab the same plank. Her name was Tess Lindqvist. I knew her the way you know people in a small town, by sight and by reputation, which in her case was sterling. She was a home care nurse, 28, and she spent her days driving a tired hatchback up and down the peninsula to sit with people in the last rooms of their lives. She was good at it the way Gus was good at boats, quietly, completely, without needing anyone to notice. She lived in a little harbor cottage out on Senate Point with her grandmother, me, who had raised her much the way Gus had raised me, and who was now slipping into the long fog of a failing heart and a failing memory both at once. I knew one more thing about Tess. The same developer who wanted my waterfront wanted her grandmother's cottage. Spencer Thorne, the acquisitions man, was buying up Senate Point parcel by parcel for the same luxury marina scheme, and me's little cottage sat right in the middle of his map like a stone he could not pour around. He had offered Tess a buyout that sounded generous until you did the math on what it costs to move a dying woman somewhere she has never been. He had started sending letters with words like deadline and final in them. Tess was being squeezed from one side, exactly as hard as I was being squeezed from the other. I went out to the cottage on a gray afternoon with my hat in my hands, which is a phrase people use without meaning it, except I actually had my hat in my hands, and I am sure I looked like a man about to confess to a crime. Tess made me tea I did not want and waited, because waiting is a thing nurses are very good at. And I just said it. I told her about the clause. I told her about the dozen jobs. I told her I had no plan and no right to ask, and then I asked anyway. Marry me by Friday, or I lose my grandfather's boatyard, I said. The words came out flat and strange, like reading a tide chart aloud. She did not laugh, which I had braced for. She did not throw me out, which I had also braced for. She turned her mug in her hands and looked at me for a long moment with those tired, steady eyes, and then she looked over her shoulder toward the back room where me was sleeping, and I watched her do the same brutal arithmetic I had been doing for 2 days. A home for me. Breathing room. A roof Thorne could not buy out from under them, while a Brandt name was on the deed beside theirs. Fine, she said at last. But it stays on paper. It stays on paper, I agreed, far too fast, and we shook hands across the kitchen table like two people closing a deal on lumber, and that was the whole of our engagement. We were married 3 days later at the county courthouse in Rockland, in a room with bad fluorescent light, and a clerk who had clearly done this 1,000 times. Tess wore a green dress. I could tell she had ironed twice. I wore the one jacket I owned. There were 2 witnesses, old Ray and Dana from the yard, who had been told only that I was getting married and had decided, in the way of yard people, that questions were rude. The justice of the peace said the words, and we said the words back, and I want you to remember that we both believed completely that we were lying. We signed our names. The pen was cold. Outside, the gulls were screaming over the breakwater like they always do, indifferent to every promise ever made under them. We drove home in 2 separate cars. The next morning, Tess and me moved into the keeper's house. I should explain the keeper's house. Beside the shed, up a little rise, sits a square shingled house where the yard's night watchman lived back when the yard needed one. It had been empty for years, used to store sailcloth and old molds, and it smelled of dust and linseed oil. But it was sound. The way everything Gus touched was sound, and over 3 frantic days before the move I emptied it, scrubbed it, and aired it out until the salt wind blew the staleness through and out the far windows. I do not know how to tell you what it did to me to make a house ready for people. My hands knew the work, but the work meant something it had never meant before. Me used a wheelchair on her bad days, and the keeper's house had 3 stone steps at the door. So the first thing I built for my marriage of convenience was a ramp. I built it the way Gus would have, out of clear cedar, the cleats spaced just right, the slope gentle, the rail rounded so an old woman's hand would find no splinters. I worked on it past dark the night they arrived, by the light of a work lamp, and when I finally rolled me up it the next day, she patted the rail like it was a good horse and said, "Now this. This is built to last." And something in my chest, which had been clenched for a year, eased by exactly one notch. The first weeks were a careful, quiet thing. We were strangers sharing a stretch of ground, and we moved around each other politely, like two boats at anchor in a tight cove, always conscious of the swing. I slept in the loft above the shop, as I always had. Tess and me had the keeper's house. We agreed on rules, without ever quite writing them down. Separate lives, a shared front to the world. Nothing more. But a home does not care about your rules. A home is a living thing, and it grows toward people the way a plant grows toward light. It started with small things. Tess, it turned out, had a head for figures, and the yard's books had been a shoebox of grief since Gus died. Because I could build a boat, but I could not balance a ledger to save my life, which it turned out was almost literally true. One evening she sat down with that shoebox and a pot of coffee, and by midnight she had the whole thing in order, and she found $3,000 in invoices I had never sent, money the yard was simply owed and had never asked for. She handed me the list without a word, just a small tired smile, and I understood that she had saved a chunk of payroll that I had not even known was in danger. She cooked. I had been living on whatever did not require a second pan, and the first night she carried a covered dish down to the shed because, she said, a man could not plank a hull on coffee and spite. The smell of it filled that sawdust air, and 3 of the crew found reasons to linger past quitting time. Within a fortnight, she was cooking for half the yard on Fridays, and the long bench by the big doors became a table, and the table became a thing the men looked forward to all week. They adored her. Old Ray, who had not strung 6 words together since his own wife passed, started telling Tess stories about Gus that I had never heard, stories that made her laugh and made my eyes sting, and I realized she was giving me back pieces of my grandfather I did not know were lost. I did things too. I fixed the cottage out on Senate Point so it would not fall to ruin while it sat empty, because Tess could not bear to think of it rotting. I rebuilt the porch where she said she and me used to shell peas. I tuned the wheelchair until it ran silent. I learned without being asked which days me was clear and which days she was lost. And on the lost days I learned to sit with her and let her call me by some other name, a husband or a son 50 years gone, and to just be that man for an hour because it cost me nothing and it gave her the world. By the end of the second week, I noticed I was leaving the shed earlier. By the third, I noticed I was listening for the sound of her car coming up Mill Street. I told myself it was the books. I told myself it was the food. I was, as Gus would have said, lying to the man in the mirror, and the man in the mirror was not fooled. There were things I did not let myself look at too closely. Whether the trustee would truly accept this marriage, or whether Mr. Coombs, who was no fool, could tell that 2 people who lived in separate buildings were not exactly keeping a home in the way Gus had meant. Whether me's heart would hold the 6 weeks we needed. And the largest question, the one I would not name, which was what my grandfather had really meant by that clause, because the more I thought about it, the less it felt like a businessman protecting an asset, and the more it felt like a message I had not yet learned to read. And under all of it, humming like a held breath, the question Tess and I never asked each other out loud. Were we still pretending? And if we were, why did neither of us want it to end? The answer to one of those questions was waiting in the shed the whole time, and I walked past it 20 times a day without knowing. In the far bay of the shop sat the last boat Gus ever started. A double-ended peapod, a small graceful pulling boat, the kind he loved best. He had the keel laid and about half the planking hung when he died, and after the funeral I had thrown a tarp over it and never touched it again, because to finish it felt like a presumption, and to scrap it felt like a murder. So it sat there under canvas, half a hull, ribs bare to the air like the bones of something patient. One evening I pulled the tarp back, just to look, the way you press on a bruise. And up inside the curve of the unfinished bow, wedged between two of the ribs where no one would find it unless they were standing exactly where I stood, holding a lamp exactly where I held it, I saw the corner of an envelope, yellowed, sealed. My name was on it, in Gus's blocky carpenter's hand. I stood there with my heart going like a hammer, and I did not take it down. I do not entirely know why. Maybe I was afraid of what a dead man had to say to me. Maybe I knew, the way you know weather, that I was not ready to read it yet. I covered the boat back up and I left the envelope where it was, and I told no one, not even Tess, and I carried the shape of it around in my chest for 2 more weeks like a stone in a coat pocket. By the 5th week, the question of whether we were pretending answered itself, in the worst possible way, in the middle of the night. It was a little after 2 in the morning when I heard Tess pounding on the shed door. I came down the loft ladder 3 rungs at a time. Mee had woken gasping, her lips going gray, her heart fluttering like a bird against a window. And Tess, who had nursed 100 strangers through exactly this, was for the first time in her life too frightened to be the nurse, because this was not a stranger, this was the woman who raised her. I have never seen anyone fight the way Tess fought that night, fighting her own panic with one hand, while she counted Mee's pulse with the other. I got Mee's chair, I got the doors open, I got the truck warm. The county ambulance was 40 minutes out on a bad night, and we were not going to wait 40 minutes. I drove the harbor road to Rockland in the dark with the high tide slapping the rocks below us, and Tess in the back seat holding her grandmother's face in both hands, saying, "Stay with me, you stay right here with me." Mee stayed. It was a near thing, and it was a long night under the hard lights of the little hospital. But by dawn, her color was back, and her heart had settled into something the monitor was willing to call a rhythm. And a tired doctor told us she was, for now, all right. Tess walked out into the gray morning parking lot, and her legs simply stopped working, and she sat right down on the curb, and I sat down beside her on the cold concrete, and she leaned into my shoulder and shook. Not crying exactly, just shaking, the way a building shakes after the truck goes by. I put my arm around her because there was nothing else a human being could do, and we sat there while the sky went from slate to pearl over the harbor. And at some point she turned her face up and I turned mine down and we kissed, once, gently, in a hospital parking lot at the bottom of the worst night of her year, and it was not on paper. It was not pretend. It was the realest thing I had touched since Gus died. And then we both got scared. She pulled back first and put her hand over her mouth, and I started saying something stupid about being tired, and she stood up too fast and said we should check on me, and we built a wall back up between us right there on that curb, brick by brick, both of us, because the alternative was to admit that the paper had stopped being paper, and neither of us knew what we were allowed to want. We drove home barely speaking. We had crossed a line, and we both pretended we had not, which is the most human thing 2 frightened people can do. That was the week Spencer Thorne decided to win. I think he had been watching us all along, the way a man watches a wall he intends to knock down. The zoning vote on his marina was coming to the town meeting, and he needed the waterfront, and the one thing standing between him and my piece of it was a marriage he was certain was a fraud. So he set out to prove it. He went up and down Mill Street asking questions, sweet as pie. He asked the harbor master whether the Brant boy and his bride lived under the same roof. He asked at the hardware store whether anyone had ever seen us so much as hold hands. He had someone photograph the shed at night, my light burning in the loft, hers burning in the keeper's house, 2 separate lights, and I understood that our careful, decent arrangement had left a paper trail that looked exactly like the lie it had originally been. Then he came to me directly. He found me at the yard on a bright, cold afternoon, in a good coat, with a soft voice and a hard offer. He knew about the clause, he said. He knew the marriage was, in his word, a convenience. He admired my creativity, and he was prepared to make it all very simple. He would buy the yard from me outright, for a number that made my mouth go dry, the moment the trust failed and the parcel came up for sale, which it would, because he intended to make sure the trustee learned exactly what kind of marriage this was. Take the money, he said. Walk away clean. Let the old place go. You don't really want to spend your life out here alone with the sawdust, do you? He said, and he smiled, and he had no idea he had just named the exact thing I was most afraid of and used it as bait. I told him no. But I will be honest, the number followed me home, because the number would have set Tess and me up somewhere warm and safe for years, and the number would have meant I could stop pretending, and stop being afraid the pretending was real. That was the night Tess and I had our fight. It started over nothing, the way the real ones do. Something about a contractor's bill. But underneath it was everything. The kiss we had not talked about. The offer I had not told her about until it slipped out. The wall we had been pretending was not there. And in the middle of it, she said the thing that cuts when you say it to defend yourself. This was only ever paperwork, Ali, she said, her voice shaking. That was the deal. You don't owe me anything and I don't owe you anything. And in 3 weeks this is over, and we both go back to our lives. She said it like a person grabbing a railing in a storm. She said it to be safe. But I heard it as a door closing, and I said something cold back. Something about how she was right. Of course she was right. It had always been a business arrangement, and we should both be grateful it had worked. And I walked out into the dark and let the shed doors groan shut behind me. And I stood in that yard in the cold, feeling exactly as alone as Gus must have felt at the end. And I finally understood that the thing I had been so afraid of had not been waiting for me. I had built it myself, brick by careful brick, on a hospital curb 3 weeks before. So I did the only thing left. I went and got the letter. I pulled the tarp off Gus's last boat, and I held the lamp up into the bow, and I worked the envelope free of the ribs with my fingers, and I sat down on a sawhorse in the cold shed at 1 in the morning, and I broke the seal my grandfather had set with his own hand, and I read. I am not going to be able to tell you everything it said. Some of it belongs only to me, but I will tell you the shape of it, because the shape of it is the whole reason you are hearing this story at all. Gus knew he was dying when he wrote it. He had hidden it in the boat, he said, because he was building this last little pea pod for the next keeper of the yard, and he wanted whoever that turned out to be to find his words when they finally picked up his unfinished work, which meant when they were ready to carry it forward. And then he told me the truth about the clause, and the truth knocked the breath clean out of me. He wrote that he was sorry. He wrote that he knew the clause was a heavy thing to set on a young man's shoulders, and that some lawyer would probably call it cruel, but that he had not been able to find any other way to say what he needed to say to me, because he had never been a man of words, only of wood. He wrote that the thing he regretted most in 81 years was not any boat he failed to finish. It was that after my grandmother died, he had let himself fall in love with the work instead of with people, because the work never left and people did, and that by the time he understood what he had traded away, the loneliness was already poured and set like a foundation. He wrote that he had watched me become him. He had watched me marry the yard the way he had, and choose the safe ache of being alone over the terrifying chance of not being, and he could not bear to leave me to that. So he had written a clause that would force me, just once, to reach for a person instead of a plank. He did not care, he wrote, whether the marriage started as real or as paper. He had married my grandmother half as a practical matter and grown the love into the spaces afterward, the way you steam a plank and let it take the shape of the hull. What he cared about was that I reached. Reach for someone, Ali, he wrote near the end. Then build the rest of your life around keeping them. That is the only thing I ever made that I'm afraid will rot if you don't tend it. Not the yard, you. I sat in that shed and I wept like a child, with my grandfather's voice finally landing a year too late and exactly on time. And I understood that the clause had never been a trap or a test or a cruel old man's joke. It was a love letter with a deadline. It was Gus, who could not say the words while he lived, building me a reason to find the one thing he was afraid I would die without. And I had nearly handed it to a man in a good coat for a number. The town meeting was 3 days later in the white clapboard Grange Hall on the square. And the whole town came, because the whole town's future was in the question. Working harbor or luxury marina, the place people lived or the place people visited. The zoning board sat at a long table at the front. Thorne sat in the first row in his good coat with his folder of photographs and his certainty. When the marina came up, he stood and he made his case smoothly. The jobs it would bring, the taxes, the polish. And then, because he could not help himself, because men like him always reach for the cruel card when they think they have already won, he turned and he pointed at me in the back row, and he told the entire town that the only thing standing in the way of all that prosperity was a fraud. That Ellie Brandt had no real right to the waterfront, because Ellie Brandt's marriage was a lie, a paper arrangement cooked up to cheat a will. 2 strangers in 2 separate houses with 2 separate lights, and he had the photographs to prove it. He said it loud, in front of old Ray and Dana and the Pelletiers, and the harbor master and Mr. Coombs and 100 of my neighbors. He said it to break me. The room went very quiet, and I felt every eye in Quarry Cove turn to me, and I felt the old fear rise up to swallow me whole. And then Tess stood up. She stood up at the back of that hall, this exhausted, dignified, proud woman who had every reason in the world to let it be only paperwork and walk away clean. And she waited until the room was so quiet you could hear the harbor through the windows, and she said one sentence. My husband built a ramp for my grandmother before he ever built a wall between us, so don't you dare tell this room what's real. Nobody moved. And then she kept going, her voice steady now the way it was steady at a deathbed, the way only a person who has stopped being afraid can sound. She told them the truth, all of it. Yes, she said, it started as an arrangement. 2 people about to lose everything to the same man, the man in the good coat, reaching for the same plank. She told them about the clause and what Gus had really meant by it, because I had told her every word of the letter the night I read it, the night we stopped pretending for good. She told them about the book she had set right and the Friday dinners and the wheelchair he kept silent and the nights he sat with me and answered to a dead man's name to give a dying woman peace. If that's a fraud, she said, then I don't know what a marriage is supposed to be, because it's more than I ever saw in the so-called real ones. And then she looked across that whole crowded room at me and not at the board, and she said the last thing quiet enough that I almost did not hear it. I don't want it to be pretend anymore, Ellie. I don't think it has been for weeks. I do not remember crossing that room. I only remember that I did. The zoning board denied the marina that night. Not because of one speech. I will not pretend a town turns on a single sentence, but because that speech reminded a roomful of people what they actually had and what they would actually lose. A working waterfront where a man could build a ramp and a wife could feed a crew and an old woman could die at home looking at the water she was born beside. They voted to protect the working harbor. Thorne gathered his photographs back into his folder with hands that were not quite steady, and he left, and I never saw him in Quarry Cove again. The parcel he had assembled fell apart parcel by parcel, the way a thing assembled out of other people's desperation tends to. And the trust was satisfied. Mr. Coombs, who had heard every word in that hall, told me afterward, dry as ever, that he had never in his career seen a clause about keeping a home answered quite so thoroughly, and that Gus, wherever he was no doubt insufferable about it. The yard was mine. The dozen jobs were safe. The lonely shipwright and the exhausted nurse, who had each started the spring expecting to lose everything, had somehow ended it with more than either had dared to want. We had gained a family. We married again in the fall, for real this time, though I want to be careful with that word, because the truth Gus taught me is that the second one was not more real than the first. It was the same promise finally told the truth about itself. We did it on the dock in front of the shed, on a bright cold afternoon at the turn of the leaves. The whole crew came. Me came clear that day, thank God, in her chair at the end of the ramp I had built, and when the justice of the peace asked who gave this woman, me said, "I do, and it took you long enough," and the whole dock laughed and half of it cried. We finished the boat together over that winter, Tess and I, the last little peapod Gus laid down. I taught her to hang a plank, and she taught me to stop holding my breath while I did it. And when she was done, when she was caulked and painted and gleaming, we launched her in the spring off the same ways my grandfather had used for 60 years, with the whole town watching and a bottle of cider against her bow. We named her the Me. She floated true on the first try, the way Brant boats do, sitting on that slate-gray water like she had always been there, and me watched her own name slide out onto the harbor she loved, and she lived to see it, and that is a sentence I will be grateful for until the day I die. The yard is thriving now. We hired 2 more hands last year. There are children's voices in the keeper's house, which is a thing I never let myself imagine in the loft years, and the light is on in the evenings, both lights, in the same window now. Here is what I know after all of it, standing in the shed where my grandfather raised me, and where I am raising my own. A boat is not built in a day, and it is not built from a single great timber. It is built from many small pieces, each one steamed and fitted and fastened with patience, plank against plank, until the seams swell tight and the whole thing holds the sea out and keeps the people in. A home is built the same way. A marriage is built the same way. Not in a single afternoon at a courthouse counter, not from one grand feeling, but plank by fitted plank, a ramp here, a balanced ledger there, a hand held through one bad night, a name answered for a dying woman, a wall taken down board by board after you were fool enough to build it. You do not fall into a life that lasts. You build it slowly, the way you build a thing meant to outlast you, and if you are very lucky, someone hands you a reason to start, even if they have to hide it inside a half-finished boat and wait a year for you to be ready to find it. My grandfather was afraid I would die alone, married to the work, the way he nearly did. He reached out of the grave with a clause and a letter, and a boat to make sure I did not. I almost wasted it. I almost signed the paper and kept my heart safely out of it, and I would have lost the only thing he was truly trying to leave me. Instead, I reached for a tired, proud, brave woman across a kitchen table, and I have been building my life around keeping her ever since, plank by plank, and I intend to keep building it until they lay me down with a half-sanded tiller across my knees in a house with the light on and someone there to turn it off. Would you have signed the paper, knowing your heart might not stay out of it?